everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the Atlanta Photography Group. We're excited to host another event that is part of High Visibility. It's a great virtual exhibition, and we've had a wonderful virtual opening and curator talk, along with a previous curator and artist panel. We have our final event this evening. For those of you who might be new to us, I want to give you a little information about the Atlanta Photography Group. We were established in 1987, and we are an artist-initiated 501c3 nonprofit membership organization, providing opportunities and support to the fine art photo community. APG is generously funded by the Lubo Fund, the City of Atlanta Mayor's Office of Cultural Affairs, the Fulton County Board of Commissioners, and the Georgia Council for the Arts through the appropriation of the Georgia General Assembly. The Georgia Council for the Arts also receives support from its partner agency, the National Endowment for the Arts. APG is also supported by our individual donors, membership, and volunteers. And these groups make sure that we are able to offer great programs, including this one, to the community. And I wanted to give an additional shout out to the Fulton County Arts and Cultural. They have provided an additional grant this year for virtual exhibitions and virtual events due to COVID. And they came up with that early on, and really are helping to fund some of the arts and cultural organizations this fall. Okay. This evening we have, as I mentioned earlier, this evening we have our final event for High Visibility. It's a curator and artist panel. Our curators for the exhibition were Le'Andra LeSeur, Emily M. Getsay, and Michael James O'Brien. And we have Le'Andra and Michael with us, excuse me, Michael and Le'Andra with us this evening. High Visibility was presented by the Atlanta Photography Group, WUSSY Magazine, and Atlanta Pride. It's also in conjunction with Atlanta Celebrates Photography, which is a month-long photography festival in the Atlanta area. Okay. This evening we have Unraveling the Gaze, Queer Artist Talk, unpacking the ways in which photography allows us to directly and subtly confront the gaze. Curator photographer Le'Andra LeSeur moderates the panel with co-curator Michael James O'Brien, with 4 contemporary queer photographers from the recent High Visibility exhibition. The artist panel this evening is C.Rose Smith, Jesse Pratt Lopez, Kenedee Hodges, Kennedy, I've spelled your name wrong there, Andrew Lyman, and Jackson Markovic. Okay. And I'm going to turn it over right now to Le'Andra and Michael.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. I am going to be moderating along with Michael with some amazing artists tonight. And we're going to be discussing the gaze and unraveling the gaze, thinking about this confrontation with the gaze and how the medium of photography being used by all of these photographers have in so many different ways, you know, directly and subtly confronted that gaze. Again, thank you to our sponsors, the Atlanta Photography Group, WUSSY Mag, and Atlanta Pride, and the co-curators of this event, Emily M. Getsay and Michael James O'Brien, who's with us tonight. So this is myself and Michael. Again, we'll be moderating this talk. It's going to be a very relaxed talk and almost like a conversation where we just want to kind of bring up these themes and threads that we saw in each of the artists' works and just kind of talk through some of those things. So really excited for it.
And I want to be sure that you all know who our curators are, who are the moderators this evening. Le'Andra LeSeur is an interdisciplinary artist working and living in Jersey City, New Jersey. Her work explores Black identity informed by the effects that regulated systems of oppression have on Black women specifically. Through visual media, installation, and performance, Her hope is to reclaim and dismantle stereotypes surrounding Black female identity through the reworking of conventional art forms and mundane objects, ultimately reshaping the context of spaces where the lives of the oppressed are silenced and celebrated in the same breath. I'm going to not read the whole thing. For both of them, her bio is on our website as well, so you can read more, because she's a very accomplished artist and doing a lot of great things. Michael James O'Brien is a photographer, teacher, curator, poet, and activist currently based in Atlanta. He's had solo exhibitions in New York, Paris, Beijing, Hong Kong, Antwerp, Istanbul, Liverpool, and Savannah, in addition to having work in London's National Portrait Gallery's permanent collection. Michael has done a lot of work for editorial and multiple publications, and he's been an editor at large of Verbal Abuse, the Poetry Zine, as well as contributing editor for Departures magazine. Michael is currently the co-chair of the Advisory Council of the Atlanta Celebrates Photography and the Associate Chair of Photography at SCAD. And we're happy to have both Michael and Le'Andra with us this evening and as curators for this exhibition. Oops.
I just want to say before Le'Andra takes over with her brilliant questions and curation, it's been an incredible pleasure to work with all of you. And I want to mention to anyone who wasn't there for the earlier conversation, I have to thank everybody. Judy created this platform. John has been extraordinarily supportive, and we have the assistance of Atlanta Pride as well. I want to mention two things very quickly. One is that when we took the title High Visibility, it was not meant to be ironic. We believe that we are visible, we're going to continue to be visible, and we won't have to discuss visibility or inclusivity, hopefully, for too much longer. That's the goal. And I want to mention one thing. I've been watching an incredible movie, a documentary about James Baldwin. And at one point, the interviewer asks him, "You were born poor, Black, and gay. How did that feel?" And his answer, "I felt like I won the jackpot." So, Le'Andra, it's up to you.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm going to get into some of the bios for the artists. So first we have Jessie Pratt Lopez. I'm just going to condense this, Jessie, a little bit, but I'm really thankful to have Jessie on this panel discussion with us. Jessie Pratt Lopez is an Atlanta-based photographer, activist, and community organizer. She is also a proud trans woman, Latina, and immigrant. She was born in Cali, Colombia, and raised in Las Vegas, Nevada. Jessie uses her artwork and platform to visibilize trans folks, people of color, undocumented folks, HIV positive folks, and all those whose existences are criminalized or erased. Jessie has exhibited work in places such as the Center for Civil and Human Rights and Mason Fine Art in Atlanta. Her work focuses on many aspects of the queer and trans experience. She has organized and curated exhibitions, including a show with SFQP aiming at destigmatizing and highlighting sex work as not only work, but as an art form. She is also the founder of the Trans Housing Coalition, a project that began as a photography-based crowdfunding campaign aimed at alleviating chronic homelessness in the trans and gender nonconforming community in Atlanta. Although she has worked primarily as a documentarian and photojournalist, her work ranges from experimental digital pieces to introspective large format 4x5 film, self-portraits. Many of her personal stories dissect gender and the performative role it plays in our society. She believes that identity informs everything in society and that it is almost impossible to separate the art from the artist. Ultimately, she hopes to make photography a more accessible medium. Thank you for being here with us, Jessie.
Thank you so much.
And next up, we have Kenedee Hodges, or Kenedee A. Hodges, excuse me. Kennedee is a queer plus-size photographer based in Atlanta, Georgia. Hodges earned her Bachelor of Fine Arts in Photography at the Savannah College of Art and Design in 2020. Kennedee finds that she is able to express her ideas through different styles of photography. She discovered her love for film and darkroom techniques early in her undergraduate studies and has been in the darkroom ever since. She enjoys working with alternative and historical photo processes, including lumen printing, platinum palladium, and photo gavard. Eager to foster experimentation in her work, she finds that her concepts communicate well through various digital formats, self-portraiture, and bookmaking. In addition to being a working and exhibiting artist, she is skilled in speaking and writing about photography. Really thankful for you to be here as well, Kennedy.
Thank you, Le'Andra.
She's also a Gemini, I have to say that.
Important.
Very important. Next up, we have C.Rose Smith. C.Rose Smith is a photographic scientist who studies the social indoctrination and performative aspect of gender. Smith makes archival photographs that analyze and highlight authentic representations of identity and sexuality. And I know C.Rose Smith, you are currently in Rochester working on your master's. So thankful for you to take the time to be with us tonight on this panel and have this discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Le'Andra.
All right. And then we also have a collaborative group, Andrew Lyman and Jackson Markovic. Andrew Lyman and Jackson Markovic are artists that work collaboratively to chronicle their romantic partnership to form a legacy that celebrates joy, love, intimacy, and spirit. Their work emblazons the struggles and triumphs of being queer in the American South. Together, they present an earnest and heartfelt memoir that acknowledges the complexities of their experience navigating a tumultuous socio-political landscape. Thank you, Andrew and Jackson, for being here, and really excited to hear you guys' perspective on the collaborative work that you've been doing.
Yay, thank you for having us. Jackson's a Gemini.
Oh, amazing. A lot of
I'm an
Gemini
Aquarius.
energy here.
Are you a Gemini?
No, but very close.
Let's get into that later, Andrew, if you don't mind.
Yes. Okay, so I first wanted to talk about the gaze. I mean, obviously the title of this talk, Unraveling the Gaze. When I look at each one of your works, I see this, again, subtle and even sometimes direct confrontation with the gaze. Wanted to just talk about that, talk about how the gaze, historically, how we define it as the gaze, whether it's under a patriarchal system or a racially biased system. How it has influenced or maybe not influenced your work, but also how it has influenced maybe the works that are part of this show. So just wanted to bring that up and see if we can start off with that discussion.
Yeah, should I go first since my photo is up there?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I think all of the above, what you mentioned, we think about the gaze. I think about, white, cisgendered, male, heteronormative, patriarchal, with a gaze that's infused with imperialism, colonialism, voyeurism, fixation, fetishization, sublime, sensational, romanticized, and ambipathy towards Native Americans and African Americans, and with their pseudoscientific view and picturesque view on the natural world. So that's something that I consider when approaching any and all of my works. And, I'll even take it a little bit further with Audre Lorde. Something that she talked about in particular was the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. And so I think that this same idea applies to the weaponization of photography, as photography was used to dehumanize and invisibilize African Americans, and specifically African Americans with intersectional identities. So this is something, again, just keeping in mind that I keep in mind when I approach, again, like the making of my work, to create authentic self-representation for agency, which is something that Frederick Douglass did.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, just thinking about the Audre Lorde and the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, and the importance of thinking about just those words in this idea of like how we kind of change the perspective and narrative around the gaze, and how like we use our work as like a tool in order to kind of claim that back is really important. I don't know if anyone else wanted to kind of speak on that. I really appreciate those thoughts, C.Rose.
Yeah, I can speak on it. I was thinking specifically about how in the previous years, it became kind of important to me that the LGBTQ plus artists in the Atlanta community specifically are kind of taking this gaze and like completely ripping it apart and establishing like a new queer outlook on things to better represent people in our community. And I was particularly inspired by this societal shift almost, an unapologetic queer existence. And that was really important to me in the beginning of this project, just because, you know, seeing people like fearlessly kind of reject that gaze is really, really important.
Yeah, going off of what C.Rose and Kennedy said, I think we are seeing a societal shift and finally recognizing how photography has played a role in historical oppression and has been wielded to further oppression. Like it was even used for a tool with eugenics, like everything that C.Rose said. And really, that's why I think it's so important to remember how identity informs artwork and how we can't separate that, and how we know doesn't, if we're gonna be true and honoring and in representing these narratives that and actually having visibility, it's letting the folks from the communities, you know, not only reclaim but like subvert, reclaim, and like actually tell their stories. And it's very difficult, you know, as photographers, you know, drawing those lines and having these conversations, but it starts here. But yeah, photography, being photographed is very vulnerable. It's like bottoming. You have to be, it's a very vulnerable act. I really, I remember this quote that Susan Sontag said that she said, to photograph people is to violate them as they can never see themselves by having knowledge of them that they can never see. And it turns people into objects that can be symbolically possessed. So with that being said, like being very intentional about how we use the camera and wield it, and how if we're using it, yeah.
Sontag.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I would I wonder about the word violation. I would think that that applies to certain photography, but when I guess when I think of Jackson in my photography, it's very we kind of willfully enter that practice of like allowing ourselves to be interpreted in each other's eyes, and like our back and forth is shaped by that exercise. And there are a lot of forms of the gaze that are involved in our work, and there's a gaze that happens in front of the camera with the camera operator, the subject, and sometimes the camera itself when we have it on a tripod or taking a selfie. And then so there's like this triangulation that happens in the photographing environment, and then it extends to viewership and who experiences the photo. So there's this immersion of the viewer into the camera or the camera operator. So by showing our work, we're giving access to a viewer, which we can control to a certain degree. We give access to the viewer into our dynamic that we create and in a way perform. So there is a lot of agency that we hold in that process, and there's an importance to being conscientious of all of the different shifting roles that happen and where our work is, I think.
I think, Andrew, what you're saying, what you're all saying, makes so much sense because it is about reclaiming, or maybe even claiming. I'm not sure it's reclaiming. I think we're claiming it. And for me, there was a great talk that I went to a conference, and Mark Seeley, who wrote a wonderful book, he used the phrase decolonizing the camera. And I think it's all fragile. That's why when I teach, I don't like the phrase capture or take. And there are cultures that don't allow themselves to be photographed because it's capturing something. I don't like the word. I ask my students not to use it. I don't like the word take a photograph. And I think what you all are talking about is if you're collaborating with yourself or with other people, that you're in control of that. Maybe control is not the right, I don't like that word either. Let's say responsible for that. And I think what you've all done so extraordinarily is eke out a very special area for defining for yourself how you want that to be seen. The narratives are very complicated, but the four of you have done. I've seen you all do this for the last several years, intimately, closely. And so I think that is the point, that when we, doing portraiture or self-portraiture, as in the case of Kennedy and, well, all of you, that gaze that you are setting up and creating to feel what that's like to do that, put yourself in the position of the person that you're photographing. And I think if you're not clear on that, that's where the violation comes in, Jesse. And you know how I feel about Sontag, I think, but we won't get into that right now. But I think that you're using that quote is yeah, well, I mean, it's smart because we have to decide where we are in position to that concept. So I think it's everything you're saying, and it's about these images. I've seen Rose's work evolve and the series that we're showing. I think one of these pictures, Rose, of you is a self-portrait, or are they all of other people? I can't remember.
One in particular is a self-portrait.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Rose.
Oh, no, I was just gonna, just to add too, I know, Michael, you said that you don't like the term reclaim, but I do think that reclamation is important in the idea of how LGBTQ persons are portrayed in the media, because it's not authentic to who we are, especially in visual culture, movies or TV shows, especially being a lesbian, more often than not, there's this toxic masculinity that is always portrayed, and that's not authentic to who a lot of lesbians are, especially masculine presenting lesbians. All of us are not toxic, don't portray toxic masculinity, or not many of us want to be men, and that's usually the concept that people leave with, and the assumptions that people leave with is that African American, again, masculine presenting lesbians want to be men, and that is not true.
Right. Well, I think all those cliches are totally out the window, and that's what we represent. I mean, we have to say they are. I don't want to go back and the only reason I nitpick about the word reclaim, Rose, is because I think we're claiming it. I don't want to reclaim it from anybody. They don't own it. Whoever these people are, they don't own it. Let them do whatever they have to do and go their own way while you all do the work you're doing. None of this work seems to me to be a reaction to anything. It's the creation of something. It's a new vocabulary and a new imagery. And that's why I say, I think we're just talking about a different way to look at this, because we all grew up without any imagery that we could recognize in any story, film, or book. You had to, what's that phrase that my friend Gail O'Neill calls it, code switching? So you watch a movie, you watch Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. We know now that Edward Albee wrote it for 4 men. As brilliant as Elizabeth Taylor was, we'll never forget that. But nonetheless, it was, so that code switching, I think we're claiming these realities. I don't see any of your work as a reaction against anything that's been done. I see it as a brand new concept, conversation, and a narrative. So that's the only reason I feel that, and it's a minor point about not nitpicking, but about claiming or reclaiming. I agree with you totally. I'm just thinking of it myself as in a different way. Le'Andra, sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that. I think both layers are important. This idea of reclamation, but also this idea of claiming. I think what you're saying, Michael, in regards to claiming, the way I view it is about this centering. I've been talking to a lot of people about like how, particularly I speak about Blackness. When I think about the reclamation, it's coming from a reclaiming of a white gaze on Blackness. And so thinking about, yes, I can reclaim, but then there's also a claiming of my Blackness in a way that is centering now who I am and my identity, which goes into this act of like really, really pushing vulnerability and this idea of like, how do you, when you talk about this idea of responsibility that we have as creators or as people who are kind of taking authority over the act of making something or claiming something, there's a responsibility and a vulnerability that comes into that. And so I think there's a layer, there's like a reclamation and a claiming, and that claiming, for me, I think that comes into play when you're thinking about this centering, you're thinking about this kind of new age of like right now, work that is vulnerable is really important because it speaks to identity in such a beautiful, tender way that it allows for someone to truly understand and maybe even become empathetic to what actually is happening. And to kind of really, really go deep into that identity or in understanding that identity, because the person who is actually claiming it is taking full responsibility over it with that vulnerability. So for me, I think it's kind of two layers, but I appreciate what you said, Michael, and also what you're saying, Rose, because I think both layers are important.
Perhaps what we're reclaiming is space in the microphone.
Yeah, is what?
Space. We're reclaiming space in the microphone.
Right.
But I also think, apropos what you and Rose said, Le'Andra, that I'm very aware of white privilege. And I'm very aware that people that grew up in a different way where you couldn't, the phrase used to be pass, that maybe that's where reclaiming something, how you've been fetishized, as Rose said, is very different than how white males have been fetishized or not. Whether you're queer is another aspect of that, but passing probably gives a different defining narrative to how you present yourself through this period. And I think for people that are outside that power structure and the privilege have had to present in a very different way. Does that make sense? And maybe that's where the reclaiming and claiming conversation comes in. But I think that we, as Andrew said, we're eking out a big space now. And that's maybe the claiming, and the reclaiming is maybe the imagery that was presented incorrectly from fetishizing, especially female bodies and Black bodies, maybe more than what we're talking about in terms of privilege or white presence. Does that make sense, Le'Andra?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. That makes total sense. I just wanted to keep going with the questions. I think we're also kind of speaking about this idea. Especially with this idea of vulnerability, the responsibility as creators that we have. I've noticed in all of your works, there's this dynamic, this beautiful dynamic where the documentation or between the documentation of self and this kind of collective consciousness that comes up. It highlights a lot of different ways that self-awareness, self-love, and care of self can kind of turn into a communal care and a connection with others. So I'm wondering if you all could talk about that process. And I'm just thinking now about like this idea of like the responsibility you take as the creator in kind of making yourself vulnerable in front of the camera as a photographer. You are speaking to, who you are, but also in that way of speaking to who you are, you're also opening it up for so many other people to connect with that. So like, how do you process that? And what is your process in kind of dealing with that dynamic?
I can speak on the collective consciousness, I guess, through a community lens. I guess before I came to Atlanta, I hadn't found myself or, came to the realization that I was trans, and finding community in Atlanta really kind of completely shifted things for me. And it brought that self-awareness and ability to connect to myself. And, as a photographer, I initially documented myself and had that vulnerability, but then I really found strength in documenting my community and other folks, and that's how I learned and grew, and how I grew into myself. And I think that's kind of like queerness and transness is very, based in community and that collectiveness. I feel like for a lot of folks, so I think for me, the process of as a photographer and as a trans person kind of evolved hand in hand. And then speaking to the vulnerability, I'm a person that thrives. I'm a social person and I'm an open book, but however, it is difficult for me to be vulnerable about certain things. So, what Michael said earlier about self-portraiture, which we're touching on a lot, and that vulnerability. I think as a photographer, everyone should do self-portraiture. I mean, that's, and that finding that vulnerability, I think is very important. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Jesse. I really feel like everybody in this panel tonight is really lending themselves to a certain vulnerability in their work. And I think that in itself is like an act of self-awareness and self-care. Again, like what you were saying, like community has been super important to me too. Specifically, my work is speaking to, the experience as a fat queer woman and how that affects sexual experiences and how we've been, objectified and shamed and hidden. And, that really is something very vulnerable that work is about. And I feel like that you address that. And, I think that there's a certain duality to having that kind of self-awareness and that sacrifice of vulnerability, especially because the work can also feel empowering to the community. Like even though it's a huge sacrifice, like you and I both specifically are encouraging people to stand up in these communities and stand up for themselves and their identity and specifically their bodies and their pleasure almost.
Yeah, and I love what you said about self-awareness, because a lot of cisgender folks are not self-aware. A lot of straight folks are not self-aware. They don't do that internal exploration. And, as queer and trans folks, we're having to do that, and we do that, and like we're evolving all the time. And that's something that whether we know it or not, we're doing it. But as being photographers, having the ability to document that and portray that vulnerability is so important. So yeah, thank you for touching on that.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking about this question a lot earlier. I really do believe in some way that almost all queer and trans and anybody who's outside of the societal norm of the people that our world caters to, essentially, we're all self-aware, right? Like that, it kind of explains the impact that these photos in this show specifically have on certain audiences. Again, like photography is a super important like purpose, right? It can make people feel seen, it can make people feel heard, and all in a format that's concrete, right? So you can print a photo and it exists forever, which I think is really, really uplifting, honestly.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I just want to add, continuing on the vulnerability aspect, that's something that Marina Abramovic talks a lot about in her work. The artist is present. It requires that vulnerability, that self-awareness, the transparency, the honesty. And I mean, it even goes into the Carrie Mae Weems "When Where I Enter," showing up as my full self unapologetically at all times. Even transitioning into W.E.B. Du Bois when he talks about the double consciousness theory, and even as persons with intersectional identities like us, we have this triple consciousness or quadruple consciousness or infinite consciousness. So this is how we show up in the world, and this is what we bring to our work. Just being completely aware of who we are, and and how we're putting this work out into the world.
I think that's amazing position. I've seen you all evolve over the years to this point, and I think there's a line in the great queer poet W.H. Auden wrote about William Butler Yeats, and he says, in a political context, poetry makes nothing happen. It survives a way of happening. And I think that's what this photography does. So by your existence and the presentation of this work, it seems to me that you've skipped over, maybe you did it earlier in your career as photographers, skipped over that struggle. And the presence that you all have presented here is so strong and so clear that I think that, you know, that idea of trying to navigate the how do I say, the structure that you all are opposed to, that we're all opposed to, it takes away its power. It doesn't exist. That structure, as far as I'm concerned, it's gone. It doesn't exist because of work like this. And I think one interesting thing, Le'Andra, to look at, I'm looking at Jesse's picture and thinking about her work, and also Andrew and Jackson, the presence in some of these pictures of more than one person, whereas Rose's work and Kennedee's work is quite different. In each of the cases that we're seeing today, there's one figure. It happens to be the author of the work, if I can say. So I'm wondering if that's the moment to think about how that is set up. I remember when Jessie was doing her first pictures of the community, and I don't know that it was a trans community, but that breakthrough of photographing the people that you photographed, Jessie, and that film you made, which I'll never forget, where they're talking and you're showing these film clips of people living their lives. And I think, and maybe this is the wrong phrase, but I think you identified them as undocumented, and they're extraordinary. And that transition to now the work you're doing now, that in-depth work about these communities, that transition I think was instrumental to your being able to do this work. I mean, I see it from the outside as that, and maybe you see it internally as something else. So, but Le'Andra, I think that the presence of one figure, and whoever said about self-portraiture, I find it frightening. I probably will never do it, but nonetheless, I accept it. Yeah, well, maybe not. You can come and photograph me if you want, but that'll be, anyway. And basically into the idea of more than one person in a picture, and how you, those worlds that you invite us into, it's so different. It's so meaningful.
I think it's important to note before getting into multiple people, what public is and what we consider public. There's a difference between public and audience. Public has this weight to it of the whole world. It becomes like this fictional boogeyman, where it's like, we're not sending our intimate photos to QAnon or anything. So there's this inherent fear, especially with queer artists, of the term public, or this concept of public and being seen and judged. So there's a moment where, at least where I need to check in, where it's like, okay, this is really for my community, and I'm okay with being vulnerable with who's going to see this. Like, yeah, we weren't sending invites to the show to, you know, white supremacists. That I don't think that's what this show is for. So if we were to do that, I would be showing completely different work. But I think there's also a consideration of, like with our work, it's like one day we could be passing on this work to posterity and showing it to like my niece and nephews, and what pictures like this mean for family too. So there's all of these different consciousness aspects that exist to think about, that should maybe be specified, and kind of doing away with like the public consciousness, like everyone is going to see this once it exits my once it comes back from the lab. Once it comes back from the lab.
Yeah, no, I do like that idea, Andrew, of thinking about like what is public, and also thinking about this space where the works will exist. I think the beautiful thing about all of your works and works that, I mean, you automatically like feel the like works that are vulnerable and that show intention. And I think that's important, this idea of intention around like, you know, your audience and who you're photographing for, who you're creating the works for. Like I can imagine, like, I mean, myself, when I'm doing self-portraiture, looking into the lens of the actual camera, like I'm looking into that lens and not seeing an audience that I know will not respect me and my body. I'm seeing an audience that I know will. And that's where that intention comes in creating the work. And so I think, like, again, going back to that responsibility and understanding, like when you are in these vulnerable spaces when creating, you have this intention to make sure the work is seen by the community that's going to uplift you, the community that surrounds you and continues to, like, you know, give you that energy that is desired and needed to continue to create this work, to basically put like on a pedestal or a platform who you are, like how your identity is important in this moment, and speaking to that is important in this moment. So I think, yeah, thinking about that public space, the intention is so important. And that's what I love about all of your works, is that intention is clear. The intention to speak directly to a specific thing, to a specific part of who you are. It's clear, and it comes through so very beautifully and clear in the way that you all are photographing yourselves, and the people that are also in the photographs with you are maybe not even with you, but when you're actually photographing another person.
I think, Le'Andra, that conversation, and it's so critical. And all of you, when I look at some of Jesse's pictures and when I look at the individual, there's a great line, you know, the book that Sartre wrote about Jean Genet called Saint Genet. And he's writing about the book that Genet wrote called Our Lady of the Flowers. And he kept writing it, and he wrote it to stimulate himself. And then they kept taking away the paper, and then he got more paper and he kept writing it. And at one point, Sartre says, the difference between someone who's creating images, and he used them to masturbate, Genet did, and then when they go public, that's when you become an artist. And I think that's interesting because it doesn't change the original concept of why you're doing, or the initiative, but your recognition of an audience. You still get the work out there without compromise, because they did not compromise. And I love the idea of that definition between a person that creates images for themselves, which is nothing wrong with that, and the moment you imagine someone else looking at it. And that's where the gaze comes in, I think, Le'Andra. That naming of this is so critical, the gaze of how you look at this work, and how, think about how we all completely and totally wrapped our heads around the early Mapplethorpe pictures, and now how we're looking at it now. That's changed also. This conversation has totally changed because of how we're becoming aware of who we are and how we view things. So I think that conversation, and you know, for me, all of you have done that, but I think inviting us into Jesse's world, and I know that sounds really corny, but, or into Andrew's, where there are other people.
Michael, I lost your sound. I don't know if anyone else did.
Did you lose my, well, maybe that's a sign from
You're
somebody.
good. You're good with us.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear you, Michael.
Okay, well, I'd rather turn it over back all to you, but I really think that that's an aspect of this. When you make this work, are you making it for yourself? Are you imagining an audience? And if you are, the audience, as Le'Andra said, the audience is one that you are taking responsibility. You're not begging someone to see your point of view. That's what I meant by claiming and reclaiming. This is it. And I think that's what's so interesting about private work or personal work, or work that's not personal enough. Who needs it? It's impersonal, but really, then it's commercial. That's another conversation, which we could have another time, but not right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, and thinking about that and kind of moving on to the next question I have for you all is in regards to kind of how these works are speaking and who they're speaking to. You know, obviously when I think about, you know, images, it's a visual representation of thought and language. And all of your works are saying something specifically to a specific person, to a specific group of people. So I'm wondering if you all can kind of speak about either the works that are in the show, are just, you know, your works in general, your practice in general, and what you feel your works are saying and who they're speaking to, and what does that dynamic kind of bring about when you're thinking about this idea of the gaze, and how your works in some cases, based on where they are, who's looking at them, can be portrayed in a different way than you intended?
Great question.
I think Andrew and I's work in the show, especially, it starts out being just for each other's gaze, and that's where we have such huge archives of images, both of us, and so it almost becomes a game, kind of matching them up and creating a visual language. So I know in the video there's several, there's a motif of like kissing selfies. There's several motifs that each of us have in our work that represent both us, but also some of them the world around us. And so, yeah, I think we create our own visual language for the two of us, and then it balloons into the rest of the world.
That's great.
Almost like people adopt our practice too.
Of looking, practice of looking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We invent games.
Yeah.
We
I love
made one
that.
video where I threw cereal in Jackson's mouth. Before we started dating, we really got to know each other. Speaking of vulnerability,
Yeah.
he was okay at it.
How are you at it, Andrew?
I
You were actually pretty good.
We did it more of him. That was pretty good.
Better than you'd think. Just kidding.
Sorry to derail.
Woo.
Le'Andra, can I ask a question? I'm going to aim this at Jesse. Jesse, when you've done the photographs with other people,
Mhm.
I'm just curious about the process by which you include yourself in pictures with other people. It's a little different with Andrew and Jackson, I think. But in your pictures, who are the, I don't want to call them supporting cast because you all have an equal presence in this work, but how do you engage these people into this world of the imagery that you then present to us, besides the access that you have, which I'm very aware of?
Right. Well, I mean, like everything I do is haphazard, but no, I'm just,
I doubt
well,
that.
this photograph in particular, sorry, what was the question again?
How do you engage the people into the photographs that you take? I was saying if they're self-portraits, it's one thing, and your responsibility for the narrative. If you're a couple like Andrew and Jackson, I think that's a different conversation. But you're bringing people in from your wider world into this. They're not self-portraits, and you're not in all of them.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering who they are. How, I don't mean who they are literally. I mean how you engage that conversation to make it part of your narrative.
Well, it really happens naturally. It's intentional, but also not. It's very natural. I really document moments that I feel it really just comes to me in an instant. And if I happen to have my camera and I have the consent of the person, like this photograph was with my ex. He was giving me my estrogen shot, and it was actually more of like, I just wanted to document it, I guess, for myself, now that we talk about like who we're documenting for. And it's important to acknowledge that, none of us create work in a vacuum unless, so, it's always considering like the audience. I guess this was for myself documenting, the first estrogen shot that I had really in a long time. And, or I think it was the first one. And being in the context of a trans relationship, or T for T, trans for trans, I just felt I wanted to document that. And then when the photograph, and then the person photographing actually was our partner at the time. We were in a triad. So talk about queerness and the uniqueness of that and that experience. So like that is literally a triangle, and that's kind of like what forms the gaze of this photograph. And yeah, that adds like another layer of vulnerability, especially, talking about trans bodies. I really wanted to, when I took this photograph, document our bodies how they were. We're not like, a lot of people ask trans people like, what is our trans, like, are we transitioning fully? Are we trans full time? Have we got the surgery? So those are a lot of questions that I've kind of subverted in my work, and like placed back on the viewer. Like, no, like don't ask me that. First of all, don't ask me those questions.
Right.
Second of all, like, we're just bodies existing, and that's okay. Like, we look like anyone else. But like really putting in your face, like, what are bodies, like removing those expectations of what bodies are supposed to look like, what trans bodies are supposed to look like. And like, because like we're all held to these unrealistic, unattainable standards of bodies that are influenced by white supremacy, Eurocentricity. So really like trying to point the camera at that, and the historical like fetishization of trans bodies and the idealization of our bodies. So with this photograph, and specifically, that's what I was kind of, that's kind of the thought process that I had before and after taking it. And with the larger community, it just like, I really, I realized that the best work that I had, it took time, even though, and it took a lot of like, vulnerable moments and relationship, and being with people for months and weeks to really capture those moments. But at the same time, sometimes the moments that I captured that were the most vulnerable or the best were like the first shot of the day. So it's really interesting how photography works that way. It's kind of like that moment, the punctum or whatever, that where you grab that moment. It's really intuitive, I guess, and it's not really explainable. And it's really just having that connection you have with the people you're photographing specifically, in my experience, and being able to, have that conversation with them while you're photographing them, not just like photographing them and then leaving.
I think that answers it very well. And there's something, Le'Andra, about this picture that to me, there's at the center of this picture, there's a core of calmness that communicates something to me. There's nothing sensational about this picture, in the sense that you're talking about a prurient gaze, and that's the thing that we're leaving behind. And I think this, that's why I asked about the presence. I knew there was a presence of a camera somewhere in that frame. And it's clear that there's and again, all I can say is it just at the center, at the core of this, with all the plants and all the things all over, there's a calmness about that seems to talk about the progression of identity. And I think that's very, very important.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I feel, I guess I have a knack for capturing those in between like moments of like those fleeting moments, if you will, because like, I mean, life is chaotic, my life is chaotic, but that moment of peace, I guess, or like just like vulnerability was like in the middle of a lot of instability in my life. So I think it speaks to the fluctuation of life and the fluidity of it as well. But yeah, thanks for.
I think it's also kind of interesting to think about.
Sorry.
No, sorry, Jesse. I think it's also interesting to think about the dynamics shifting in terms of like who has like authorship with the person taking the photograph in that image. It becomes a communal act at that point, which goes back to this idea of like, how do you, within this vulnerable like presence of creating work, how do you, think back to not necessarily making it just about self, but in that awareness of self, making it communal and inviting a community to be a part of it, not just in the act of viewing, but in the act of actually taking and making, or excuse me, not taking, but making the work, and being able to create the images that come out of it. I wanted to go into another question that we kind of touched on a little bit, But I mean, within all of your works, there's this invitation, there's an agency that focuses on demanding more from the viewer, which I think is extremely important. You know, as a viewer, you're not just able to look at the photographs and walk away. There's something that captures you, which demands you to question your own perspectives and your own kind of enabling in this idea of the gaze and how it lends to this objectifying bodies in a certain way. And so I wanted to talk about, like, you know, how you all process this idea of like being able to create works that demand more from whoever's viewing the works, and being able in that way to kind of create this language within those works that really pushes the viewer to not just look at the photo and leave, but to do more in terms of like how they understand the photo, how they process what the photo is giving to them, and what kind of research, whether before or even after they're looking at that photograph, that the viewer then has to go and do in order to better understand what they're taking in. So I'm wondering if either Rose or Kennedy, if you can speak on that just a little bit.
Yeah. So I made this work kind of with the idea that it might take the viewer a longer time to process what the purpose of the project is, because they are quite small. The size isn't on there, but most of them are like 6x7. They're really small. And in my process, I really felt like that it was an important part of the creation that the viewer needed to spend more time with the work. The project is titled Bambi. And so like Bambi kind of lends itself to time with kind of two sides of the audience, right? So again, what Andrew was saying about our intended audience and community. It's kind of speaking to like people who are projecting the gaze. So like the white, male, cis, straight gaze, and people who are subject to the gaze. And my point, it is, you know, speaking to a fat, queer, sexual experience and fetishization almost. And, you know, like this can either be something for the viewer to think about, like, okay, am I a person that is projecting on this person's body? Or am I somebody who is a part of this experience? So either way, whoever's viewing it is spending a significant amount of time with it. Because honestly, like, I think a lot about how like fat women and fat bodies in general are kind of in the shadows, a lot, like, as well as trans bodies and a lot of queer bodies, and how it is a fetishization most of the time. So like people hide us and people, you know, are violent towards us. And, you know, I want people to think about that. I want people to look at this photo and see me looking back at them and think, damn, like I'm the problem. Like, so yeah, I mean, I would say that my work specifically is an invitation to the audience to, you know, like dissect or investigate their like position and like what they're projecting onto the work. And again, the size and the subject, which is me, is like they're both lending to that, I'd say.
Kennedy, can I ask you a question before we move to Rose? Do you see these pictures, and I've watched your self-portraits evolve, do you see these as performance or documentary self-portraiture? How are you positioning yourself? Because it seems to me you're acting out a certain kind of narrative. And maybe it's your reaction to what you just described, or are you revealing more and more about yourself?
Yeah.
Or is it about, okay, you understand my question, obviously.
Yeah, I do. So I get this question a lot about my work. Is it documentary? Is it fine art? Is it, you know, a character? And I specifically went into this project inspired by the works of Cecil Beaton, who was like photographing really glamorous, high femme, super sexualized, thin white models. And I kind of wanted to see myself in that light. And so, yeah, I would say that this is a character. Both inspired by that work and also inspired by Prince and how sexual he was. So yeah, this is really like a super sexualized version of myself being documented. So I would say it is a bit performance and it is a bit documentary because, you know, sometimes I feel like this, like, it's not like completely, you know, a character. I mean, you can see tonight, like I love to give the glam, and You know, that side of me is super important.
Yeah, I think referencing Cecil Beaton is so great. I give these kind of suggestions to people whose work seems to be the opposite. And I think what you pull from that, Kennedy, is so clear, the set, the artificiality of the set. And don't forget he photographed his sisters because he had no one else to photograph. We can talk about that later, but I think you've done that really well. And I see the balance of performance and a revelation about who you are that sort of unfolds, I think, as you are responsible for this narrative.
Mm.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, so excuse me, I just want to say in regards to my work, it's both analytical and conceptual. You know, I always begin with the entry point of research for whatever series I'm building upon. You know, so you know, I've been doing a lot of conducting analysis on just gender constructs. So like I have a book called Gender Articulated, or, you know, Judith Butler's Undoing Gender. So the entry point with my work is thinking about these terminologies and thinking about how can we dismantle them, eliminate them, or, you know, create new terminologies that best represent who I am and who the people are, the persons are that I document and record. So for tomboy, for example, just the language itself, you know, growing up as, you know, like a young girl and whose identity is expressed with fluidity, the terminology or the classification is usually tomboy, like, oh, she's a tomboy. And then, you know, as I continue to progress and develop, then I realized like that terminology does not represent my identity. And then all of these other terminologies start to formulate, you know, going into, oh, well, she looks like, if she's dressed like this, my assumption is that she's a dyke, or she's butch, or she's a stone butch, you know, whatever those types of assumptions and associations are with again, a masculine presenting lesbian woman's identity is. And so these are the things that I'm thinking about when I approach the work tomboy. So, so yeah, I mean, you know, and a lot of it is intuitive. You know, I know we were talking about zodiac signs earlier. I'm a Pisces, so like Erica Badu,
Of course you are.
I'm a Pisces, and I'm sensitive about my shit. Like it's true. So the way that I approach my work, it is a lot of it is it's subconscious. It's very intuitive. It's you know, it's rhythmic. It's you know, composition. Like I use a lot of music to I see you, Urban, thank you. But I use, you know, I use music to inform my process and work through my process. And so I do center my work on, you know, blue and red, you know, the hot and the cold, and, you know, that coalesces into purple or indigo. And to be honest, like the rest is left to the unconscious. You know, the ancestral memory, and that fades to black, and black houses, you know, depth and awareness. And that's something that I use to approach the makings of any of my work.
I love that. Thank you for that.
That's amazing. And, you know, I think also, Le'Andra, just really quick, one of the great things about this work, Rose, is that you flipped several cliches upside down. And one is presenting pictures that have a masculine look to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you've addressed them very clearly in these photographs with that, what you just described. So the femininity, the masculinity, the cliches about both those things. It's like little boys that when they grew up, they were called sissy. That kind of bipolar cliche is something that is so old fashioned. And I think that you've done that by presenting and calling it that. It's a great way to sort of sum up a whole dichotomy in one image or in several images. Really excellent. Well done.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, I think like Rose, you stated it so well, like this idea of like the way language is so archaic and the descriptive nature of like who we are and how our bodies exist. And so thinking about like the work as this kind of new form of language, it's like this futuristic way of being now, you know, as like artists, like all five of you, you all are speaking language of the future right now in the way that you create works. And I think that is so beautiful and important in the way that as a viewer, you're demanding us to change our thinking and our understanding of like what language is, but also like how we even view things through our own eyes. And that's why I was so drawn to all five of your works, and was so excited to just speak to you all tonight. Last question before we get to Q&A was I want to just see if everyone could just talk about, you know, what's next for your work and practice, any things that you have coming up, thoughts and process that you're kind of going through in terms of creating. I know it's been a wild year, but just really excited to hear about what you all are working on and what you all are thinking through, you know, during these moments and these times these days.
I'm working on my thesis
Oh,
at Georgia
no.
State.
At Georgia State?
Yeah, at Georgia State.
You're teaching right too, right?
Yeah, I'm teaching intro. This is my third intro class that I'm teaching. It's really interesting. I was expecting certain challenges to come with the online platform, but I got different challenges, and the other ones were just fine. But I suppose my newer work, I'm doing more performance and live reading of poetry, and I've been figuring out ways to incorporate Zoom, and I've been thinking about what presence means, and how we vibrate in a different way in person versus online.
Sounds great.
Yeah, really quick, I want to take it back to representation and just point out, you know, just the importance of representation, right? And I remember when I was a freshman at SCAT, Le'Andra, I think you may have been, that may have been your last year. This was like 2012. And I just remember like seeing you and I was like, this person looks like how I feel, you know what I mean? And not being like, I wasn't, at the time, like I wasn't truly embracive of my sexuality and my identity, right? So, you know, being able to see you and have that representation present and apparent was so important to me, you know what I mean? And I think, again, that's the purpose of this work that we're all creating is representation, self-representation, so that other individuals, younger individuals, are able to see the works that we're producing to identify with them. And so I'll just move into some of the things that I'm working on now. Like I mentioned early on, that I'm a first year grad student at RIT in Rochester, New York. So the work that I'm doing right now is honestly just bearing witness to the things that I'm creating, analyzing, you know, just my own self-portraiture, working with the analog process and alternative process, and continuing to explore the gender constructs and how it has impacted, you know, my queerness.
What alternative processes are you working with?
So right now I've been looking at cyanotypes, and also wanting to get into salted paper prints.
Ooh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Let's talk.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I guess since I started talking, I'll go next. So I'm like super inspired by this show. Like I'm so inspired. Like I haven't had like an inspiration boost in a while. So like this show has given me a lot of confidence and a lot of inspiration. So I plan to move forward in creating photographs and writings centered around the queer experience and in the queer community, and in regards to my own personal identity as a fat queer woman. I still feel like I have some work to do on the subject of how fat women are portrayed in photography. So I do believe that this project has some room to grow and deserves a little bit more investigation. And again, like, because of how inspired I was by this show, I'm like really, really interested in experimentation right now. So I'm going to be trying out some new mediums, like Andrew was saying, like maybe some performance, maybe some fun stuff, like installation and stuff, and just, you know, finding new ways to kind of explore these concepts.
We can talk.
Yeah, I want to talk to all of you, actually. I'm like really excited.
It is
We need a group text.
Yes.
sad. Survivors.
Yes.
I agree. This has been very heartwarming and inspirational, seeing all of y'all's work and discussing work. It's been so long. I've been kind of taking a break, you know, focusing on other things. Running an organization, it's been a lot. But
Jesse raised over $3 million.
Yeah, we got to talk about that. Like,
Amazing.
literally legend.
yeah, so dealing with that, you know, which it began as a actually photography campaign called documenting these women that I encountered, that I became my close family, these Black trans women, and it evolved into the Homeless Black Trans Women Fund, and which evolved into the Trans Housing Coalition. So, but moving forward, I want to continue to use art as activism, continue to use my platform as a photographer to uplift other voices, and I guess I can announce that I'm in the biennial coming up in February.
Oh, Jesse.
So that's exciting. Yeah, this year has been a lot. Like, a lot has happened this year, but also nothing, because I am stuck at quarantine. So I'm removed from Atlanta. I'm currently in Lawrenceville. So it's very hard
Oh
to
my God, wait, I'm in Buford.
Oh my God. We need to talk.
Girl, we're gonna hang
Not
out.
me anything. But yeah, I really want to connect back slowly into the community, following CDC guidelines, of course, and continuing making the work, because we're still here. You know, the queer and trans folks are disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and people of color. So it's a lot of work to do right now, you know, on the ground. And as artists, there's something we can all do right now to help take care of each other. So.
You know, also, Jesse, what you're saying, and I think it's very relevant, these platforms, and I discuss this with Le'Andra, these platforms really work for us, because while we're waiting for the galleries and museums that take one or two pieces once in a while, this platform gets this work out there till it becomes more than lip service. And it's an accident, and not a good one, but the silver lining is this is how you all can communicate this work and get it out there. And when things open up again, it'll be there, it'll be ready, and it's been ready for prime time, but now the quality of this is extraordinary. And I think that's one of the great things about this, Le'Andra, is that we've had this chance to get our opinion out there, get our images out there, don't you think?
Yeah, I think, you know, although it's been a weird,
Yeah,
you know,
very weird
situation within the arts, I think it's been beautiful to have this space to be able to communicate from like far away and be able to have work shared on a larger scale with a wider, you know, audience. And so, yeah, I think, you know, especially with this show, I've just been so excited to just see how like all of the works have come together and how they've just been in dialogue with each other. So just thankful for you all and excited for all the things that you all have coming up.
Amazing.
It's really exciting to hear. Well, I know, I don't know how much time we have left, but I'm wondering if we could take a few questions, maybe.
Le'Andra, can I jump the queue and ask a question from Michael Fink, who's in Savannah?
Yeah.
And he's asking, could you, or any of you, or all of you, just give a little bit more of a definition between gaze and the phrase presenting? Does it make sense as a question, Jesse? Because we're talking about, the title was Unraveling the Gaze and the idea of presenting. So anything you can just throw in those two terms, how we're using the terms and what you mean by them. And then other questions, Le'Andra, I'll let you volley.
Presenting in the gaze. I mean, I guess presenting, I don't know, like presenting would be could be a synonym of performance. I mean, I feel like I said, like we're always creating work either for ourselves or for an audience, or even, so it's not in a vacuum. But I guess, I mean, when making work, it is important to consider how we present it. And like, I don't know what you were talking about, Michael, with social media, it's a very different way of presenting that work. It kind of, I don't know if it loses the intimacy, but it may lose some of the impact, some of the, how one of the questions you posed about the work forcing you to stop and like look at it, but like that's not how our brains are currently being trained because of social media and the oversaturation of like images. So it's very hard for people to get the full experience and the full presentation and intention of our work. But then, that's the price we pay for, for the work getting to more people, and visibility, the price we pay for visibility. Visibility, I think, is a double-edged sword. We see so much visibility now, so much inclusion or diversity. However, like the systemic things that have created these conditions are still existing. So we really have to challenge, like, what is visibility, and is it enough? And how, if we're, like what do we do after visibility? Because visibility is also vulnerability, as we've talked about. So like, how are we supporting the folks that are visible and vulnerable? How are we,
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point about the after visibility. It is about that support, and how does that support go beyond the actual creation of the art and into the community that needs it. So thank you for that, Jesse. I have a few questions from Theo. Hello, Theo. Thanks for joining us. Theo asked Kennedy, was the smaller size intentional in your demand for deeper looking and intimacy with the image?
Well, I mean, the size had a couple factors. That process that I made these photographs in is called it's palladium. There's not platinum in it, but it literally is only possible as like a contact print. Well, it's not only possible as that, but that's just the way I liked it, because these images were made on like 4x5 film negatives, and then contact printed straight onto this hand painted palladium like surface. So that was mainly the reason why they're so small. I go back and forth on whether I like the size or not, just because this work is so not incomplete, but it's still in progress. But yeah, I think that it really did kind of, end up being like a nice way to present the work, because it does kind of like it does invite people to stand closer, because they're small, right? They're like, they're just as big as your face. So you really got to get in there and like give it a good look.
Yeah, no, that's a great response to that for sure. One more from Theo. Actually, I have two more from Theo. Rose, what are some of the other influences and inspirations for your art?
Yeah, there's so many. Oh my gosh. I would say certainly Zanella Maholi, Lola Flash, Barbara Kruger, Jenny Holzer, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis. I mean, the list continues. Projection, video. Just the idea of merging the still images with moving images and creating layered narratives, and maybe even combining that with sound. So yeah, there's so many influences, even music.
Thanks, Rose. I'll have to introduce you to Lola. Eventually, I'll send an email introduction. To each artist, this is also from Theo. How much performance exists in your work?
I would say a lot in mine. I feel like my work is probably the like most performative in the show, because I am kind of putting on a character and getting in this like femme queen kind of outfit. And you know, I am performing for the camera. I mean, I'm sure you guys saw it like 10 times, but like there's one where my ass is towards the camera. Like that's a total performance. And you know, I think in that way it you know, it is about performativity, and it is about, I think that performativity especially can lend itself to like confidence as well.
Yeah, I'll add to that and just say, you know, I think performativity, whether conscious or subconscious, is always apparent in any, you know, in any photograph. You know, we always perform for the camera, and it's nonstop. You know, whether it's surveillance photography, we're always here because the personal is political. You know, you whatever clothes you decide to wear, that is a political statement. The brands that you're wearing, if you support H&M, you're supporting fast fashion. So, you know, it's just everything is performance, and we can't escape it.
Yeah, that's a lot. Like speaking on like performance, like I feel like people forget that like as human culture is like a lot of has been developed, I mean, around performance, and like it's not, I feel like it's kind of projected on queer people, like that we're performing something that is unnatural, or that we are, you know, performing something that we aren't. When reality, we're living our authentic selves, and when we're only performing when we're not, you know, when we're concealing the aspects of our queerness or transness or nonconformity. And it's like we're all performing all the time, like our identities. And it's like, if like the sooner we realize that, the sooner people will stop vilifying people for it. But you know,
That's a great answer, I think, Le'Andra. I guess we're getting close, but also the idea of authenticity in balance with performance. I think finding that combination, which all of you are doing in different ways, is really an extraordinary part of this process. So performance seems to indicate artificiality, but it doesn't have to. In the case of all your work, it doesn't. And then you have authenticity. So who defines what that is? It is because I say it is, or it is because that's how you see it. I think that's a really good balance of how this work, all of you, looks in all different ways, with the singularity of Kennedy and Rose's work. And Rose's, arguably the tomboy thing is a performance or not, you know, and Rose's Bambi story, which has so many connotations. And then, so I think all that balance between authenticity and performance is really unique about this work and this narrative.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. Well, I know we're close on time, or we're at time.
Judy's going to pull the plug. We all have to come back together anytime you want. You know our email. We'd love to keep doing these. We need you to keep doing them.
No,
we
this
got to get it out there.
Beautiful conversation. I'm so grateful to you all for just being able to share so much about your work and process. It was extremely important to hear from you all. So I thank you so much for being here tonight.
Yes, and thank you all. I mean, I think this was a really great exhibition, and I'm really happy that that APG, Atlanta Photography Group, was able to host it and be part of it and really join in the conversation, because I really think it is very important to have this artwork and artist be visible.
Yeah. Thank you for giving us the platform, Judy. Sure. That was really great.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Michael and Le'Andra and Em, for connecting all of us. I'm so happy to have this as an introduction to new artists that I don't know.
Yeah.
Of course.
All right.
Never
all
been
right. Thank you, everyone. Please be sure, if you haven't checked out the online exhibition, to visit atlantaphotographygroup.org. All of the work is available online. It's also available for sale. And the art and the page will stay live on our website after this. And since I now have it in my to-do list, I will be adding Andrew and Jackson's video to the page, so you can all check that out as well. Okay. All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you
you
all
all
very
so
much.
much.
Have a great
Thank you,
night.
everyone. Have a good
And
one.
thanks for joining
Thank
us.
you, artists. You're wonderful. Thanks, Irvin, for seeing you. Mary Stanley's in the house.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody. See you all soon.
Bye.
Great,
Right.
great audience and great
Bye-bye.